Okay, so our last, but definitely not least speaker is Wojciech Anzel. Yes. Wojciech is my colleague from Nokia Kraków. For the last couple of years, he's been living in the magical world of cellular networks, mostly co-processing, RF performance, signaling stuff. He's a very experienced tester. And recently he decided to find out how tester experience can influence creating new product requirements. So he's taking a deeper look at the testability aspect of our deliverables. Some of you may have already seen Wojciech at a Eurostar conference in 2015, or maybe you have heard one of his frequent lectures at the AGGUST. Without any further delay, let's give a floor to Wojciech.
Thank you. 1, 2, 3, thank you. When they ask us what do we do in our work, who we are, we usually say that we are testers or test engineers or software engineers or telecommunication engineers or any kind of engineers, in fact. Usually the second thing that we have to say then is that no, I will not fix your printer, no, I will not fix your phone for you, but we try to emphasize the fact that we deal with technology, that we create new technological stuff. It means that we are not medicine doctors, economists, not anything else. And also in our it means that we deal with code, with the hardware, things like that. It also means in our subconsciousness that we do not care about any kind of other factors, other things. We do not care about the business. I don't know how to run the business. I'm just an engineer here. We do not care about strategies, product strategy or selling strategies, those kind of things. And we tend to be proud about it, but the reality is a bit different. And what I've learned in a few years working as a test lead is that if you want to be a good engineer, you actually have to embrace the fact that there will be non-technical factors impacting you, impacting your work. And I'll try to show you some of my ideas, and I'll try to show you my inspirations, how my mind went, and how I learned those conclusions. So by the end of the presentation, I hope you will understand what those factors can be. I won't give you a comprehensive list of those factors, but I'll at least try to show you some good examples. And I hope that you will understand your engineer's role in that word. So there will be four of those inspirations that I have. First one is pretty short. When I was taking my ISTQB training, I was also helping to organize it within my organization. And I was collecting feedback after that from my colleagues, from people that took part in that training. And part of the feedback was, and I was feeling pretty much the same, that, well, I am in this ISTQB training to learn how to find more bugs. I'm not interested in business, in money, in schedules or the people that will do things. Why are we talking about that? I'm here to learn how to find bugs. I'm a tester, I just want to find bugs. Well, if you spend half a day out of 3 days on an important training, then it means that actually it is an important thing to talk about, and you actually have to accept, approve, and embrace the fact that there will be such factors. Number two is I want to give an example from within my organization, but before that, I have a question. which one of you has seen this book? Read a chapter, read it whole of this book? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, not many, so probably not many of you will be interested in the fact that I have something really interesting for you. And what I am about to show you is the first time it will be shown in the public, because there is going to be second edition of this book, and this is the cover of this book. Now, the reason I'm telling you about it is that there's my name on this cover, and there's also Eva's name on this cover. So Eva and myself, or Nokia Kraków, we were invited to put a chapter to this book, and so we did, and we wrote an article or a chapter for this book. And before we sent that to the publishing house, we sent that article internally for a review among our colleague testers, amongst some of the senior engineers that we thought that their input might be valuable and interesting and important for us. And that feedback was various. So we had some good feedback, we had some feedback regarding the language we write, which was all good points. And we received also some parts of, I would say, bitter kind of feedback. And together with Eva, we were sitting over that one email that we received from one of our colleagues and trying to digest it, trying to think how should we react to that email. And we were going through that points over and over and over again. And in the end, we realized that we are not going to change anything in the article because the person that has sent us those comments, we decided that the person didn't fully understand all of the nuances that we put into the article and didn't hold the broad idea that or the broad perspective that we tried to put into that article. So a conclusion I have drawn personally was that sometimes the best engineers that are in your organization, sometimes the guys that will be the only ones that you will ask to integrate to perform the most difficult integrations, that you will ask to test the most fragile parts of the functionality of your product. Those kinds of people that dig into very dirty details down to earth, they won't have a broad perspective and broad understanding of the product or the strategy, or basically they look down and they tend not to look up. So from this very place, I want to encourage you to always look for the broader perspective and try to understand as many points as possible. In that particular case, it was a discussion about the automation framework we had in our organization. So if you think about it for a moment, so suppose you have automation framework A and automation framework B, and you have to choose a framework for your project to come, or your projects to come in the next few years. So what would you look at to choose an automation framework? First, probably you will look at all the technical factors that are there. So the framework has to be stable, it has to be modular, it has to have reusable libraries, you name it, a lot of factors. But if you go into some discussion with your colleagues, with other people that do automation, read some forums, talk over the coffee at a conference, whatever place it will be, you can hear, for example, a quote like, "It's easy to write in it." And partially it is a technical factor, because if it's easy, then we're writing good quality of the code. So it's a technical factor in a way, but in a way, it's also a non-technical factor, because if something is easy, then I'm fast at writing test cases in that framework. If I am fast, then I develop more and more test cases in one day, so I can get the product out quickly. And time equals money, basically, so I can earn more for the company in shorter time. So it's kind of non-technical factor already. Another thing you could hear is, for example, I like that syntax, I know how to write in it, I like writing in that language or in that framework. It's cool, it's nice. Partially it is the same as the previous, but there's again more to it. If a person tells you that she likes writing in it, it means that he enjoys it. It means that maybe he won't be looking for other jobs in different companies. So if you are a manager having a group of people knowing framework A, and if you want them to switch to framework B for whatever reason, you got to be aware that there will be a lot of discussion and a lot of talking and a lot of convincing them. Another non-technical factor that can play here is, for example, good support from the community or good support from the vendor. Now, this might be contradictory to some of the technical factors that we have. For example, stability, right? We can say that today the framework is not stable. I was trying to run some test case, the environment crashed. But I reported it to the vendor of the framework, and after one release, after one software upgrade that they did to the framework, my test cases started passing. So it might mean that, you know, if a framework has a good support in the word, then it might be useful for you. Or it might be the framework to choose over the next few years. It might also mean that the community support might, for example, mean that if there is a large group of people developing similar test cases, similar features, maybe you do not have to reinvent the wheel. Maybe you will just change the tires on that wheel and keep going on. In case of our organization, there were actually two different approaches. One was everybody else will be using this framework. Why aren't we using this one? So that's one approach, and you see it links with the fact of having good support from the community. And the other one was, we've been always using this one and it worked just perfectly. It's a perfect technical solution. Why do we change? So I don't want to judge any of those approaches. I don't want to tell you which one is better. I just want to show you the fact that, you know, you have a strict technical problem of choosing an automation framework, and from that problem you go into very non-technical problem of having a serious conflict within your organization. And that's a thing you actually do not want to achieve, of course. You do not want to have a conflict in your organization. You do not want to you do not want to let frustration on both sides, both from the side of the engineers and from the managers. You do not want that to raise. You end up wasting your time. You end up wasting your energy on basically pointless discussion. The discussion itself maybe not is not pointless, but it's not pointless if both sides are convincing each other. If both sides are camping more and more on their statements and where they are, and they do not communicate and they don't convince each other, then you're basically in a pointless discussion. And this drives the organization in a strange kind of direction. I put question mark here on purpose because, again, I don't want to say if it's a good direction or a bad direction. Is it a good direction from technical point of view, from the business point of view? I don't know. I just want to show you the effect of, there's a business decision there's a technical decision that you try to do, and there's a lot of other factors that influence it. Inspiration number 3 that I have is testing pop culture, I would say. So some of you might have seen this graphic somewhere in the world so far, and probably if you've seen that, you might as well thought that, yeah, I've been there. I think I understand what's happening here. So let me tell you what it actually means. Let me tell you what goes on deep in our minds when we think of a case like this. It might be, for example, oh, not again. I mean, we've been fixing this 10 times this month, and it still doesn't work. Come on, how many more times can we fix that? Or it can mean, why are we releasing this code? It doesn't work. Am I the only one caring about the quality of the product? Are we only chasing deadlines, or are we actually trying to deliver some quality in the software? Or it can mean, for example, listen, Mr. Manager, I don't know if it works. I need to run my 2 weeks extensive regression testing in order to tell you if it works. But what if, going back to the graphic with the cats, what if the delivery day is today, right? So if you set emotions aside for a moment and think about it in non-emotional way, you have your product, you have your delivery line that's in the place where I come from and some people on this room come from. In our case, this delivery line is probably half year long, and it's from just a schedule, it goes to a kind of Gantt chart of death kind of thing that has this big red delivery sign at the end, or P7 or whatever you call the milestone. And as long as you are far off the delivery, everything's fine. You are doing your testing, the developers are doing their code fixes, everyone does what he's paid for, and everything is fine. Until you're 1 day or 1 week from the delivery, and things get really serious. Again, in our world, in the company where I work, in the industry of LTE base stations, which we're trying to deliver, fixing even a minor bug is a pretty complex thing to do. Because if you are testing an LTE base station, in order to test it, you need to have an LTE base station plus a smartphone doing some calls or some operations on it. In your laboratory, you probably have 1,000 of those, so you need some RF cabling or whatever devices will separate the signals from each other. So it's a pretty complex environment. If you are just off the delivery, you're probably running hundreds of megabytes of data for 7 days, for example. You're running a long, extensive test that collects a lot of logs, so you need to store that logs somewhere. You need to analyze those logs. It costs a lot of money, a lot of time. Later, the code analysis happens somewhere between the tester and the developer. Let's say now the developer makes the code fix. Even just putting some new code is a pretty complex thing, because there's probably a few hundred of developers committing to one place, so your SVN is not a single laptop somewhere, it's a very big server and very big infrastructure and a lot of facilitation that you need to do. Also, the base station has a lot of components, so before you can build it, you need to wait for all the components to align, to come into one line. It's almost like, you know, planets in solar system coming to one place, and only after they come in one line, you can create a snapshot of that and compile it. And the compilation itself is a cost again. Now imagine that the developer's fix didn't work for whatever the reason is. You go back with the cycle again. So it's a very costly thing to do. If you are in the today is the delivery day scenario, and you're you're here trying to do the fix and you're unable of that and you're delaying your software, where I come from, if your release is half a year long, the biggest consequence that might happen is that half a year ago, you probably have promised that software to some customer, and that customer is actually waiting for it, and you have a signed contract for it. So at some point, if you are delaying more and more, you end up having contract penalty fees. But if you are, for example, in some kind of software business, startup, mobile applications, whatever, it might happen so that if you delayed your software for 2-4 weeks, whatever the time would be, you might end up with your competition delivering similar software that solved your customer's problem, and you basically end up maybe not selling your product and going out of the business in a way. In any case, your customers might be like, oh, not again. They are late again. How many more times? You can't do any business with those guys. They can't deliver even simple software. So you might lose your trust, brand, your customers. There's a lot of things here. But if you have a bug in system that is so big that you cannot see the product from behind the bug, from behind the fault, and it actually covers everything, the system, the product, the delivery line, everything, you also have a problem. But now the role of the tester is actually to properly say how big the problem is. And mind you, this is not an easy task. It requires a lot of understanding of your product context, of the world that the product exists in, the problems that have to be solved with your software or with your hardware. So the tester's role, and they say it at all the trainings, that you have to fill in this trivial, minor, critical kind of description, plus, as we say in Polish, words plus music. So you have to tell your managers what does the customer have to do in order to see the problem, to find the problem. And this is your role, to, one, be able to tell what it is, two, educate your managers and educate the people that make decisions about the product, whether the problem is actually this huge or is it some kind of minor problem. However frustrating and boring at times it might seem, going to the endless meetings and explaining the same thing 10th time today, unfortunately or fortunately, this is our job. And if we say that this guy is trivial, then we have a problem, and then we do our job badly, and then basically the same things can happen, right? The consequences are exactly the same. So if we try to quantify it in some kind of way, probably you can quantify it with a Pareto distribution. Of course, disregard this chart because I've drawn it in the best engineer's chart drawing tool, which is Microsoft Paint. But basically the Pareto distribution tells you that 80% of your bugs are found by 20% of your cost. But in the same time, getting the last 20% polish quality of your product will cost you 80% of your testing cost. So there is a saturation to the bugs you will be finding, and there's a fine line in the fine-tuning you want to do with your product. And the bad news for you as a tester is that you do not get to decide on this point. It's fortunately or unfortunately, it will be the managers that will decide about it. And you only get to tell them how good or how bad it is. Now, a couple more considerations. Imagine now for a moment, get back in your mind to your product that you test in your office, and think what would happen if your boss told you, okay, we are releasing today. Now, if you have done your test planning correctly, nothing bad will happen, because you should be able to tell your boss, okay, let's release it. As of today, it's the best quality we can have today. It's not the best quality ever that the product gets, but it's the best quality that we can get today. That's a kind of rule of thumb in test planning. Another quote I heard once from actually a manager taking those decisions about the product strategy, was that, our product doesn't actually save lives. It's kind of cherry on top, kind of enhancement to the world the product lives in. So I don't need it to be perfect. I just need it to be good enough. And I need you guys, you R&D guys, to be able to fix the bugs from the field quickly. So again, going back to your product that you have back in the office, how do you shorten your delivery cycle, and how do you shorten your fixing cycle? And now you can imagine why we have been talking about the automation so much, and there was such a huge conflict about the automation. But I have two kind of questions for you that should help you understand how to shorten the delivery cycle. So one is your test environment. So how compatible is your test environment with your customer's environment? If the customer will tell you, I did A, B, C, and D, and the product crashed, are you able to go to the laboratory and do A, B, C, and D, and provide the development with logs, how many times they will need it in order to fix the problem? And number two is, are you able to tell anything about what happened to your product if it crashed in field? Now, since I'm working in requirements now, this guy is pointing at me rather than at you, the testers, but it's a job of us all to work on the product debuggability too. And the last inspiration that I have, it's not exactly related to testing, it's more in the telecom industry. And it's maybe not the most fascinating one that can be, but I think it tells a good story that we can take out something for us. So back in 2012, when Apple was releasing iPhone 5, for whatever the reason was, they decided not to support one of the LTE frequencies. I think it was about LTE 800 frequency, which for operators around the world is pretty an interesting frequency because it gives you a bigger coverage. It's a good kind of frequency to have your network in. And operators worldwide back then were heavily involved in auctions for that particular frequency. If you are a mobile operator, and you want to serve LTE on some frequency, you have to buy it from the government. And 800 megahertz particularly costs much more than, for example, 1800. So in this situation, Apple makes a decision about their software. They actually supported it in hardware, but they didn't support it in software. So based on such, putting such product in field, the operator said, well, if 90% of our subscribers, of our end users are using iPhones, we are backing off from those auctions. So a consequence of software support was that governments of few countries didn't earn a few $1 billion because of Apple's one decision. And if you are now a company like Nokia, Ericsson, or whoever else, you do not get to sell your 800 megahertz product because of that. But there is also a different question that comes to my mind, at least, when you when you see a case like this. First, do we use iPhones in our testing? And the answer is no, but it has its reasons. But the more general answer is, a more general question is, how do your customers use your product? How do you know how exactly the product is used? And again, there are two considerations to it. One, coming back to the test environment, is it able to reproduce the bugs that your customer will give you? That's always number one. Number two, if you are testing some brand new product, if you are testing some kind of proof of concept, something that hasn't been there in the market, and your test environment will be different from the one that will be out in the field, you might end up having tests that make no sense at all. Because in your lab, everything will work just perfectly, and in the real world, it will not work at all. So you need to pay attention to that. And the other side of the scale is if you have a major product. If you have a major product that works in field for years, has a very big deployment, very big scales of deployment, you might end up having test environment that will never reproduce a problem that is out in the field. And if it's so, maybe you do not have to, maybe you should stop supporting that testing at all and focus, for example, on the debuggability side of the product. And the second consideration is how you talk to your customers. So if you are, for example, developing Android application, you probably use the App Store feedback as much as possible. And remember that if you are doing that, you have to take that seriously. You have to consider that seriously, because if your customers will give you feedback again and again, and you will not fix your application accordingly and update it accordingly to what the customers are telling you, in the end, the customers will go away from your application. Number two is talking to customers. And I don't mean only sales representatives talking to the purchase guys and negotiating the prices. I mean engineers talking to engineers, or engineers talking maybe even to the CTO. However stressful it may seem, it actually has been an experience in our organization, and it turns out that it creates good synergies, that it creates, the CTO sees the engineers that actually do a lot of work and put a lot of effort in the product, in fixing the problems, and the engineers should be able to, when engineers are hearing the CTO who will tell his stories about what are his problems, what are his use cases, and so on, you should be able to take that input and create a better product with it. And number three is a lot of industry trends, I would call, that basically say, have your customer do your testing for you. It can be gamification, it can be testing coding dojos. There's a number of it. Basically, gamification works in such a way that if you have a customer that will report 10 faults for you, you give him a nice t-shirt. If you have a customer that reports 20 faults for you, you give him a nice mug or whatever else. There's a lot of such ideas in the industry. It's very popular in some of the software companies. I encourage you to go and search for that ways of testing. So to sum up, if I was to put what the most important non-technical factors will be, those will be there are three things here. So one is money or time equals money. There's the people, and there's the company itself. So question, how timely can you deliver? How fast can you deliver to the market? Can you release, in weekly cycles, the so-called MVPs, so minimum viable products, right? This balance between cost of implementation and the quality of your product. All of those questions that relate to the money and to the time. Regarding to people, I think it's pretty obvious that the people that work on the project have to know their stuff about the technology. They have to be skilled enough to do it, but they also need to be enjoying the work and enjoying their colleagues. And the company itself is, again, a lot of non-monetizable factors, non-monetizable things that are out there. So the customers, the trust you have built, the brand, and for example, the product strategy. Now, again, like to sum up, I would like to encourage you to, familiarize with all those. Try to set yourself in some kind of context of that, and I want you to realize the fact that as engineers, you have to be aware of those. You have to be aware of the context you and your product are in, and the more you know and the more you learn about the context, the better the engineer you will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wojtek. Let's switch to the Slido questions. I hope it's working.
It's not working on this one.
Yes, it's working. Okay. So the first question is, do you think that test engineers should raise their objections loudly when managers want to release poor quality products, or just get used to it, as in the end it's management decision based on wider picture of business case?
Yes, definitely speak out loudly. Yes, that's what I told you. That your role is to loudly speak out what you think the product quality is, why is it so bad, and put up all the details of that idea. The more details you put to that discussion, the better coverage you have yourself in your consciousness, right? If after such communication the managers still say that, okay, we want to release poor quality, then it's not your fault anymore. But if you did not speak out, then it's your fault too. Did this answer the question?
Okay, moving on to the next question. How are you calculating cost of testing quality in overall SDLC cost, and how to show benefits of testing to senior stakeholders?
Whoa, that's a complex one. Well, I don't know how to calculate the overall cost. Well, the cost consists of a lot of things, and I was trying to put as much as possible in that one slide when I was showing how do you fix a bug. It's, whatever, the definition of the metrics can be very different. I don't have a context of a particular organization to tell you how should you calculate your cost. It can be, calculated in money or in time you take to deliver a product. It's a tough question.
Okay, moving on to the last question on the Slido. Is missing documentation a bug that should be raised by testers?
No. No. Mind you, I am working in specification right now. So I can dig my own grave right now. But, well, is it, so maybe rephrase, is it the problem actually that you have a documentation? If it is a problem, then you probably should go to your system engineer and ask him for that specification. But if you know what you have to do without that specification, maybe there's no need for it. Again, it depends on the context, and that's a message I was trying to put here in this presentation. Maybe I didn't make my point well enough. Testing basically is we say that testing is a context activity or context-driven activity. So it all will be depending on the context. If you are testing an LTE-based station, you probably need some specification to know how it works. But if you are testing an Android application that, draws funny cats, maybe there's less documentation that you need to be written, and maybe it's not a problem that you don't have that documentation. And maybe, the only communication is that I don't like the application because it's hard to use it, but it's not something you can put in the documentation sometimes.
Okay, I can see a follow-up question. What about the user documentation? I changed but it seems to fit the previous one. So what about user documentation?
Like the end user documentation.
I guess use cases, right?
Well, okay, so apparently it seems that in that context, it's something that is needed and is missing. So probably it is a bug, it is a fault. I'm just not sure if it's a fault of your product or rather a fault of your organization.
Okay, moving to the next question. Any idea how integration event helps people to be better engineers, testers? Okay, not sure how it is.
Not sure how does it relate to
the topic of a presentation.
To the topic, but I will answer this one. How does this conference make you a better tester? And that's the end of my response.
Okay, do we have any other questions from Slido? Okay, we still have time for one more question. So if there is anyone in the audience who was afraid to use Slido and would like to ask a question via microphone, just wave your hands.
If no, then I'm around here. So
yeah, Wojtek's around, you can ask him. Okay, thank you very much for your participation, and let's have a big applause for Wojtek.